Hi, and welcome to an overview of Creative Destruction, the board game. So what is Creative Destruction? Creative Destruction is a board game designed to get players thinking a little unconventionally. The idea is that you're making investments in companies, you're also investing against other companies, and doing this all while trying to maintain some uncertainty to your opponent about what you're doing and what companies you're invested in and which companies you don't like. So it's sort of a kind of a pokerish type game where you're making these strategic investments and trying to conceal at the same time how you're investing, making sure that you're taking actions that are sort of benefiting the companies in the long run without giving away too much information. Where is this game at? So right now this game design is complete. It's been heavily play tested, a couple, maybe 24 sessions of physical board game testing. There's 2 prototype versions of the game, physical prototype versions, and there's also a very unfinished preliminary digital version of the game, which is what you're looking at right now. And the purpose of that was to kind of get the thing up and running, be able to show it to people who are looking at it for the first time in a quicker way than, say, going through a rule book. When was this developed? So this was developed over the last, call it 8 months. So middle of 2016 is kind of really, I think, when the playtesting and design ramped up. Finished around November of 16, and then for the last 2 or 3 months, I've been working on building a digital port for the game in Unity. And so that's what you're looking at right now. So that's kind of where the game is at. It's, the artwork is very much unfinished. It's very preliminary. The design work on the physical version, again, also very preliminary. It's 2 prototypes that are sort of based on stuff I ordered on the internet. So yeah, so that's where the game is at right now. And who am I? So I'm the designer, the creator of the game. My name is Justin Anderson. So yeah, this Creative Destruction is kind of my baby. And why? So the why for this is sort of, I've been interested in getting a game into an area that is sort of untouched, relatively untouched, I guess, in the board gaming world. I've played a lot of games like 18xx type games, and I've played a bunch of Euro games, a lot of the usual stuff. One Euro game that I quite like is Imperial, and I just found there's this potential space that didn't seem to have much of an area where it's kind of more hidden information than a game like Imperial. So maybe call the inspiration behind this game maybe something like Imperial with hidden information. Obviously, it's a very different game than that, especially how it evolved, but maybe that was kind of the why or part of the inspiration behind it. And as the game evolved, it got to a point where I was actually pretty happy with it. I've been working on a number of designs, none of which I'm at the point where I'm really satisfied to take it and try to publish it. But this game, it gotten to the point where I was like, yeah, you know what, this is really good, and it's a high quality game, and I felt like it's probably a good time to push it out. So that's why I'm trying to get these published. So let's get into how to play. So I'm just going to skip through a couple menus here, get to the main game. So what you're looking at is kind of the main play area for Creative Destruction, and we're just going to walk through how do you play it. So the objective of the game is to maximize your net worth. So how do you maximize your net worth? There's actually no money in the game, but there is value. So here are in this particular 3-player version of the game, there are 5 companies in play, and we're going to be buying and selling shares in these companies. And our objective of the game is to be the player at the end of the game that has the highest value of shares. So as we're buying and selling shares, we're going to add up the total value of all those shares at the end of the game, and whoever's got the highest value wins. That's simple. So how do you increase the value? So right now what you're looking at is, here's the initial value is $30 a share for each of these 5 companies, and they're projected to stay at $30 a share because we haven't done anything yet for this first round, or for this first turn. So the game is split up into 5 turns. So this is what this 1 here means, is that we're on turn 1, and it's going to be played out over 5 turns. And during those 5 turns, we're going to be taking actions that are going to be affecting sort of the value of the game, of the shares that we hold. Initially, each player is dealt 1 share, one long share, meaning that they want that share to go up, all things equal. So in this case, we've been dealt the red company. So if we go back to the red area, that would be ironically orange is the name of the company. So that currently we own one share worth $30 in orange. Now, none of the other players know that, and they've also been randomly given one share in one of these other 4 companies. They can't also have orange. So there's 5 companies available initially, and they've each gotten one of those shares. We were dealt the red share. So 2 of the shares are not owned by anyone, and the other 3, including orange, is owned by us. Okay, so that is the initial sort of distribution of shares. So on the first action, what we're doing, or turn, is what we're doing is we're taking an action. So this tells us the phase. So this is the turn 1. This is the phase. This is the player that is currently acting, so player 1. And this tells us a little bit more detail what's going on. So player 1 is taking an action, and they have 4 action markers remaining. Okay, so we'll be talking more about action markers. They're the sort of amount of energy, call it, that you have in order to take actions. All right, we may as well finish describing the rest of the stuff you're looking at here. So these are giving you your various menu options. So you can click on that and it'll take you through. This one's the Senate. We'll get into that in a bit. This is the company menu. This guy is the stock price menu. You can sort of move that around. And then this last one is the stocks that you hold. All right, and we won't get into that one. So the board itself is split into 8 inner sectors and 4 outer sectors. So your inner sectors are clothing, food, services, entertainment, so on. And each of them has a certain amount of demand, which is the number that you see there. That's randomly distributed at the start of the game. These outer sectors are basically fed by these inner sectors. So for example, a relatively simple outer sector would be something like land, where what it does is it takes, for the amount of demand that is in land, you basically add these 2 together and you subtract 3, and then that would be the demand out in land. And these other sectors work in a similar way. Generally they take the adjacent sectors and use that to figure out what the total demand in that sector is. So that's a bit of the board composition. Over here you have monetary policy. So monetary policy on stimulus, what that basically means is companies will tend to be more profitable in the short term, but in the long run it might actually be bad for the economy, and vice versa. Austerity, these kinds of policies are generally going to be better for the long term for the companies, but also a lot more short term on profitability. Okay, and then up here you have the turn order, so player 1, player 2, player 3, and you have the turn order for the next round, which currently hasn't been set. So that's a bit of the board composition, and we'll get into a few more of these other things later. Let's get into the phases, which is kind of the core of the game. So the main phase to think about is the action phase. So that's what we're in right now. It's turn 1, we're in the action phase, and it's player 1. So they can take actions. What are the different actions that you can do? Well, you can increase or decrease demand in one of these sectors inside one of these inner sectors. That's one type of action. Another action is you can actually rotate the board using a Senate action, right, which is over here. And then finally, you can add new company assets to the board. So the first thing to do, let's add a company asset. So, the company that we own is actually in this case we're owning purple because I've just done a relaunch of the game. So we're owning the purple company. So if we go over to our company screen, that's status bucks. We can take one of their capital. So this is how much sort of cash they have available. And it costs 1 cash, so 1.0 cash, to deploy a new asset into the economy. So think of that as like constructing, a new type of industry somewhere. So in this case, let's take a status bucks capital, and let's be very topical and deploy it in food, because this is a coffee company. So food and coffee, I guess, would sort of be in the same bucket. Now, what this is telling you is how many actions it costs. So player 1 has 4 action markers available. This action costs 1. The order type is grow. There's actually 7 types of orders. Grow is the one that we're trying to do. The company that's trying to do it is status buck. The sector is in the food, and the source of the capital is going to come from the bank. So it's actually coming from the capital pool, but anyway, that's just a helper. So we're going to hit confirm, and then you'll see that it animates and throws that asset over to here. So basically now status bucks has call it a factory, or in this case, some coffee shops in the food industry. And there's reasonable demand there, and that's what that is. So now one thing we can do is we can click over right away to the stock screen, and you can see that that placement is actually, that company is going to actually generate profit. So we're not going to get into all the exact calculation of how profit is calculated, but because there's forward demand there, there's some operating cost associated with this stuff over here. So basically cheaper operating costs if you go closer to stimulus. And then the net profit is going to drive the stock up by $2. We can also see how that net profit's going to get spread out. So in this case here, Status Bucks, you can see that they've now taken an action, and their capital is now, remember it was 2.7 like everybody else, now it's 1.7 because they've deployed 1. But they're projected to earn a profit of 0.2 capital, and that 0.2 is basically going to get added. You can see how that's up 0.2, so they from 1.7 to 1.9, so it's going to get added to kind of to their cash reserves. So that's a reasonably profitable little business there, and that's that's the grow action. So notice they now have three actions remaining. So any player on any given action impulse, they can take 0, 1, or 2 actions. So in this case, so far we've taken 1 action. Let's take another action. So let's say we want to deploy, we kind of like that move, so let's put another Status Bucks in the same location. So we're going to do it again. Now notice the cost is now higher. So actions that this player has are 3, but the cost now is 2, and that's because that's because the company has already taken an action to deploy capital. So every time somebody tries to do another action with that same company, the cost goes up of the action. Okay, so anyway, let's deploy this, and now you can see we've got 2, and you can see right away it switched to player 2, and that's because you can only take a maximum of 2 actions, and so player 1's turn impulse is certainly over. So player 2 now has the option to go. Now let's open up the company screen for player 2. You'll notice now that there's 2 action markers here, and the capital, as we expect, is down to 0.7, and notice we can see the profits have doubled, which makes sense because now we have 2 in the same location. But we can't actually now, if we try to deploy that capital, you'll notice we don't get the option to deploy it because we don't have enough capital for Status Bucks. So they only have 0.7. You need at least 1 or higher in order to deploy capital. So this company says, hey, we want to deploy, let's say, Macro Hard. We want to throw them out there. So they're going to grab this guy, and this time, we'll notice a few things. So first of all, if they try to deploy it here with Status Bucks, they're not allowed to do that. And this is because the very first time that you try to deploy capital for a company, so in this case, this is the first yellow asset being deployed, it has to be somewhere where there's no other assets, right? So this just forces all the companies to start the game off in separate sectors. Okay, so let's find a valid sector to place in. So in this case, let's place in capital, just for fun. So we're going to throw this over here, and you'll notice it only costs 1. So now this company has an asset over in capital. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is let's do a Senate action. So we've done already 3 grow actions. If we click on the grow, we can see Status Bucks actions are now costing us generally more because there's been more actions taken for them. They've got 2 actions deployed, and Macro Hard are only 1 action, so it's a little cheaper. So let's, instead of deploying more capital, let's try to do a Senate action. So if we click on the Senate, which is this guy, what we can do here is rotate it left, right, or do nothing, just kind of kill the action. So in this case, let's rotate it right. So if we do that, we'll notice that player 2 is doing the action, it's costing 1, it's a Senate clockwise. So then we confirm the action, and the inner sectors have rotated 45-degree angle to the right. So that now affects particularly how the outer sector profitability will be. So for example, in the case of capital, which is where Macro Hard has been, they now have 0 demand here feeding it. So the way their profitability works is you add the demand, so 0 plus 0, you times that by 2, in this case 0, and then you minus 8. So their profitability right now is minus 8, in addition to the operating costs that they have to pay. So this company is actually losing a lot of money. So if we open up the projections for profitability, you can see that Macro Hard is going way down in stock price, and that's because their factory is very unprofitable over here. Now we could change that, and for example, let's say player 2 decides to do another rotation. So they see the 7 demand over here in travel, and they want to get that over into capital. So they rotate that again, and this time the profitability now is 7 times 2, which is 14 minus 8, which is, you know, a much higher number. So if you click on here, you can see that, oh wow, now instead of losing money, MacroHard is actually going to make a lot of money. So just one Senate, some lobbying at the Senate was successful, and now they're a much more profitable business. So you can see that there, especially in some of these outer sectors, there can be pretty wild swings in profitability depending on player actions. And if I'm the rest of the players, I can see that, and I can say, hey, this player, whoever rotated this 7 demand into to help this yellow company, well, maybe they own yellow. It's because they've really helped that company's profitability. And then you could, as a result, take actions against yellow because now you know that they like yellow. So it's a way to learn about the company. So we've hit on a bunch of actions. Let's do one other action type. So the third main kind of action is adding or increasing demand. So let's say this player's finished their turn, so they skip, and now we have player 3, and they notice that it seems like player 2 really likes yellow, so they're going to actually decrease the demand for travel. So that you can click on these guys here, and if you click again, it'll switch to decreased demand, which is what this is. Now the way decreased demand works is 2 of the demands are going to get, one of them is going to go to the pool over here, and one of them is going to go to one of these adjacent sectors, and the player can decide who's doing the action, which sector. So he doesn't want to put it into housing, he wants to take the extra one and put it into entertainment. So one will go over to entertainment, and one will go over to the pool. So he clicks on this, confirms the cost in this case is 1, and sure enough, that went from 7 to 5. And you'll notice there's a star here, which means an action was taken in the sector. And what that does is, let's say the player wants to take a second action, the same type of action. Well, this time, and he wants to do the same thing, he just wants to completely destroy demand and travel. So again, he clicks on this arrow. Now this time, the action cost to him was, he has 3 actions remaining, action markers, and it's going to cost all 3 because there's already an action in there, and the price increases much more quickly if there's already actions in or near the area that you're trying to do another action. So it sort of deters people from taking multiple actions in the same area. In this case, he says, you know, whatever, I'm going to bite the bullet, and he does it, and so now you can see he's got 2 actions taken here, and he's really hurt the profitability. So if we go over to yellow again, once again, MacroHard is now starting to lose money because the demand for travel has been reduced so much. All right, so that's actually a reasonable overview of the core mechanic in the game, which is really what drives most of the play, in that people are basically taking companies, they're deploying capital. You can actually shift capital as well. So for example, you can move capital from a company that already has deployed it into an adjacent area. There are some limitations, like for example, if you already have deployed capital somewhere, then the next time you deploy, you either have to deploy in somewhere where you already have capital deployed or a business, or adjacent to it. So I couldn't, status books, for example, couldn't place something over here even if it had enough capital to do so. It would have to be adjacent to its existing operations. So that gives some kind of limit on what companies can do once they've been placed, and that can be strategically important, because if a company is sort of surrounded by lots of demand and good locations, then it might have, even though it might not be that great, in the long run it'll probably be strategically, probably be a reasonably strong company, and that can give you lots of information what people hold, etc. So that should be a decent overview. So in summary, you can sort of place capital or shift capital from company assets. Whenever you do a placement or a shift, it's going to increase the cost for future placements or shifts for that, just for that company. So in this case, if I wanted to do a status books action, it's going to take a lot more cost because the action markers, people have already taken that action. If I want a second type of action that's most common, would be sort of increasing or decreasing demand using these kinds of markers. And then the third kind of action is the Senate rotation type of action. So that is over here. There are and I'll just touch on it really briefly here, but there are very uncommon actions that you can take as well that come later. So if a company, for example, generates waste, so that'll happen if they're very unprofitable, they'll start kind of producing waste, and you can actually use capital to offset waste. So basically you pay off some of the waste sort of thing. So that's another action, but you notice when I click it, you need at least one waste in order to remove waste. Duh. So yeah, so we can't do that action, but that's actually another kind of action that is available. It's actually the last kind of action that we haven't touched on, but relatively uncommon. So after, I'm going to pause the video here, and then next video we'll talk about the next phases in the game. All right. Okay, so now we're going to go into the next phase. So the way this kind of works, we're back to player 1, so it's going to keep looping around the action phases right up until people start passing. So the way passing works is if you've taken 0 actions, you have the option to pass. So when you pass, you forfeit any remaining action markers that you have. This guy has 1 left, and let's say they pass, and then what that does is it gives them 1 of 3 positions on the next turn order. So that's basically saying which spot in the turn order they want to take. So let's say this guy, he wants to take the first spot. By the way, this game, everything is in turn order, starting from first to third, which makes sense, except for the investing round, which is in reverse turn order. So the investing round is when we're selecting our investments. That happens from 3, 2, and then 1 in this case. So let's say this guy, actually, he wants to be the first to invest, and so he decides to go with position 3. So he selects position 3, and now it's player 2's turns. Player 2 actually has no actions remaining, so their only option is to pass. So they pass, and notice player 1 has already taken the spot, so let's say they decide to go with spot 1. And then finally player 3 also has 0 remaining actions, so they decide to pass as well. And so when they pass, player 2's already taken the first spot, player 1 has already taken the last spot, and so they decide to take, well, they have to take the middle spot. Okay, so after that's been completed, it's gone into the next round. So this is called the monetary policy round. Now in this case, it's on round 1. There is some randomness to how the monetary policy is set. Basically, it's somewhere between stimulus and balanced, and we don't want to let the users know or the players know what the monetary policy is until they've all passed on the first round. So this is just a first round seeding thing. It doesn't run like this normally in future rounds. So in this case, it just shows us the dice roll, which was a 2 down here. And that means the policy initially is set to loose. And that's just, again, that's just a random distribution. So loose is the initial policy, and now it's triggered the profit, the operations round. Now this is one of the great things about the digital version of the game is that it does this all automatically. This is actually not too long of a process, but it probably takes somewhere like between 5 and 10 minutes to do on the physical board game, whereas here it's instant. So it's kind of a nice aspect of the physical version of the game. And so in this case, it's showing us how the companies did. So we can see Status Bucks, they were profitable. You can see that Macro Hard was unprofitable, so its stock share went down, and the other companies didn't deploy anything, so they didn't change. So here it gives you a little more specific. So Macro or Status Bucks actually made 0.4 in profit. Macro Hard lost 0.4, and you can see that reflected in how their capital is going to change from 0.7 in this case. It's going to go up, and in this case they're actually going to go down. And Macro Hard will still actually have more capital than Status Bucks, but remember Status Bucks actually deployed 2 assets, whereas Macro Hard only deployed 1. So that sort of makes sense. So that's the operations phase. It gives us all the operations numbers that happened. So we can close those, and now it goes to players 1 turn to make a decision. Now this is a good time to say introduce player powers. So each player at the start of the game has a unique power set. So player 1 is actually the banker. So the banker has certain strengths and weaknesses. For example, their strength is that they can affect or influence how monetary policy is set, and they also have another ability to affect whether companies issue shares or not. So in this case, let's say they want to influence monetary policy for the next round and kind of push it towards stimulus. So they can click on this green button, and depending on how profitable the companies are, will affect which ways they can influence the track. So in this case, they're going to click the green arrow, they're going to influence it, push it this way, and then but they still don't have full control. They just can influence the roll. So then they click this blue button here, which triggers the roll. In this case, the dice roll was a 4. It was modified in the direction to push it towards stimulus, and it turns out that modification was enough to push it all the way towards stimulus. So now you can see that the monetary policy has been switched. So next thing is the raising capital round. So this is kind of the last cleanup phase. So new capital is the name of the phase. And in this round, what we see is all the companies that have 1 or less capital, they have less than 2 capital. So in this case, Status Bucks and Macro Hard both have less than 2 capital. They will raise capital. So you can see their share count is going to go from 1 to 2 for both of them. And that's also going to cause them to have more capital. So they're going to issue shares, and as a result, they're going to get more cash in the company. So you can see the effect that's going to have. And then all these other companies, because they already have over the 2 capital, they're not going to issue any new capital. So they're going to stay at 1 share. Number of shares is important because it affects how volatile the stock is, for example. Companies that have a lot of shares issued tend to be more liquid and bigger companies. And so they're going to be less volatile, whereas companies that are small could be more volatile. So that's kind of the main thing to think about there, share price volatility. Now, the banker has another feature, which is they have the right to change a policy. So if a company was not going to raise capital, they can force it by clicking here to raise capital. So in this case, they clicked on it, and you can see now they're going to raise capital from 2 to 4.7, and they're also going to issue share. They could also say, no, I don't want to do that. I actually want to prevent a company that was going to raise capital from raising capital. They can only switch the policy of one company. So you notice when I switched macro hard, it automatically switched off orange because I can only select one company to affect. So let's say in this case, they want to just affect macro hard. They want to prevent them from raising capital. So you can see that the capital is not going to be raised, and then they click the green button just to confirm that. Okay, so now we've actually moved into turn 2. So this is actually how the start of a normal turn looks. Turn 1 is kind of a short turn. So turn 2 starts with an investing round. So let's just move that out of the way, and you can see now we're on turn 2, and the first phase of turn 2 is investing. Now, player 1 is the first to invest. Remember, player 1 took the 3rd spot. So even though if you see the player order here, player 2, player 3, and then player 1, they took that 3rd spot in the player order, they actually have the 1st spot to choose when you're during the investing round. So the way this works here is we can see that this is the current discards. At the start of the investing round, each company has 2 potential shares that could be invested in. All right, so 2 yellow, 2 red, so on. Initially, 1 card is pulled out faced up, randomly face up. In this case, it was purple, and is discarded. So nobody can play with that card. So now this is what's available for this player to invest in. They have to, from this available pile, they have to put cards into 3 spots. They have to invest 1 of them long, 1 short, and 1 to discard. Note, whatever this first player discards isn't going to be seen by the other players. So it's a face down discard. So they're not going to see it. So in this case, let's say this player says, you know what, I want to double down. They look at the board and they see that yellow's not doing very good, and they say, you know what, I think somebody's really anti-yellow, so I'm gonna short yellow. So they move yellow over here, which means they're gonna benefit if yellow goes down. And then they also notice that that purple did well, and maybe they think purple's well positioned. One caveat to this strategy, though, that should be highlighted is that you remember your net profit gain is actually going to be relative to where the current stock price is. So, for example, purple is this share that they're buying right now is only going to pay off if purple performs higher than its current share price, not from its initial share price. This one already made money because it's up, I think, $4 a share. So they've already made some money off of this position. But this position is only going to make money if it goes up further. And same thing with the yellow. The yellow would only make you money if it went down further from where it is now. And then let's say they don't want anybody else to be able to invest in yellow for whatever reason, for shorting. And so they decide to discard that. So once they've filled those 3 spots, now they've got all their choices have been made. They can, if they want to switch their choice, they could do that. They could swap it out, whatever. But in this case, their choice has been made, and they decide, you know what, I'm done. So they're going to click OK, and then it goes to the next player. So player 3 was the next player in order for investing. And in this player's case, you can see that the yellow is no longer available. Remember, that's actually a discarded yellow. This player doesn't know that. The only thing they see is the purple. They don't know what the first player decided to buy and long and short and discard. All they know is that this is what's available. But they have some knowledge. They know, for example, that 2 yellows and 2 purples are missing, and one of the purples is here. So they know that the 3 cards that the first player had in this case, and so they can make some deductions later on in the game. So you have partial information, just not complete information. And so now this player decides to say, let's say they decide to offset their red position initially. They don't want, and this means that further on they're basically hedged to any performance in red, and they decide to go long this one. So then they confirm their purchase, and then the last player goes, and again, this player has sort of different information than the second player had. So you'll notice that there's kind of strategically, there's different amounts of information given and different options. So for example, this player has less access to shares than the other players, but they also have a reasonable sense of what the other players are holding, because, well, they know that they're not holding blue. So there's kind of this interesting information dynamic that evolves throughout the game. Anyway, so let's say this player decides to go long red and go short that, and discard the two blues. So now the turn, or the investing turn, is over. And by the way, the investing is sort of the second most important phase. I'd probably say it's the most important phase, but it's the action phase and the investing phase are really the core phases of this game. Okay, so now we go into a creative destruction phase, which is really just a random rotation. In this case, there was no rotation, so what can happen in this phase is the board can change its configuration a little bit, kind of like a Senate rotation. And we rolled, in this case, a 3. So a 1 or a 2 would rotate it in one direction, a 5 or 6 would rotate the other direction, and a 3 and a 4 would cause nothing to happen. So nothing happened, and now, lo and behold, we're at the start of a new action phase. So round 2, action phase, now we revert to player order, which is player 2 goes first. Let's remind ourselves what player 2 owns. So what this does is, first of all, it shows us this round what was discarded. So this player still doesn't know what this discard was. We know, because we played all 3 players, that was that yellow card. But they don't know, but they do know what the face-up community discard card was, and they also know these 2 cards, because those are the 2 cards that they left when they finished the turn. They were the last to invest. So it just reminds them what was in the discard pile, and then what their current holdings are here. So they really like yellow, and they really like red. So let's say now they want to take an action for red, so they go like this, and they place it in this nice little 5 demand area. And maybe they don't want to be super obvious, and so they just say, hey, let's put 1 over in this 2 area. Maybe they're worried that people are gonna, figure out what they're up to. So that is that's the action phase, and that's basically, yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, that's kind of the game. There's a few little maybe minor points that we could add while we're here, and that's really just the pool. So the pool, the way this guy works is, basically it has this max, so you can never, what this pool is basically demand. Think of it as these demand numbers just sitting over here, kind of available to go on the board. And there's a maximum amount of demand that can be in the pool, in this case 7. So every time that somebody does like a decrease demand, so let's do a decrease demand here. So we decrease demand, and you'll notice the pool just increased to 7. So what that means is if somebody tried to decrease demand again, so let's say we try to decrease here, you'll notice we're at our max. So the pool is at the max. So in this case, if you try to decrease demand, instead of going to one of them going to the pool and one of them going to the side of the choice, they're both going to go one to one side and one to the other side. So in this case, if I went like this, actually they're going to go to these 2 sides, because there's no space left in the pool, basically is what that means. And vice versa. So if you're increasing demand, so let's skip to the next player and say we're going to increase demand, that's actually going to pull 1 from the pool. So the pool is going to go down to 6 here, and that would continue. If it went all the way down to 0 and you tried to pull from there, it actually wouldn't pull, because there would be nothing in the pool to pull from, and it would pull from the 2 adjacent sectors, as opposed to pulling 1 from the adjacent of the choice of the player plus 1 from the pool. So that's kind of how that works, and the pool can actually change depending on the policy. So if you're constantly in stimulus, then the pool is going to start to decrease, and you're going to have less demand in the game overall. And if you're constantly in austerity, vice versa, your pool is going to actually increase, and it's going to spill over and actually get into the game and cause more demand to happen. So that's kind of the idea. That's a bit of the offset to constantly being in stimulus. Now, what's the advantage to being in stimulus? Well, this is the operating cost. So basically, every single block or asset that's in the game, whenever we calculate profits, we subtract from those profits whatever on a per asset basis we subtract depending on the policy. So for stimulus, we subtract 1 per block. In austerity, we subtract 6 per block. So 5 for tight, 4 for balanced, and it's smoothed over to stimulus at 1. So you can make a lot more profit in stimulus, and companies can lose a lot of money in austerity. So during austerity, kind of the stock market generally goes down. No, most of the companies kind of go down together. Maybe whoever's got more assets deployed would tend to go down more. But yeah, so that's kind of what monetary policy does, and it's an extremely important aspect of the game. I'm going to wrap up there, and we're going to use our last video to talk about the player powers. Okay, for this last video, we're going to talk about player power. So the way player powers work is every single player has a unique capability. So we've already touched on player 1's abilities, which are to influence this track. Basically, they can push it this way or this way pressure it this way or this way. They don't have full control over it, profitability affects out of the companies, but they can have some influence. They also can influence when companies are raising capital. So here's an example where some companies raised capitals, they have 2 shares and other ones didn't. So they can sort of reverse the policy of one company at the end of each turn. So that's player 1. Player 2 is called the bureaucrat, and they have the power of red tape. So the way red tape works is after their first or second action, they can take the red tape action. And the way the red tape action works is they click on this guy and it lets them basically throw down a couple kind of dead actions. In this case, it's a 5-player game, so they can do 3. 2 or 3 player games, they can do 2 red tapes, but they basically throw some red tape on the board. In this case, you know, we throw it into these 3 sectors. They can also throw it into the Senate or into the individual companies, and all that does is it basically acts as if an action was taken, and makes it more expensive for other players to take actions there. So it's a great way to sort of make it less inviting for other players to take actions, and they don't need any sort of support to do that. They can do it on their own. So that's the red tape action. I'm gonna quickly fast forward us to the end of the round. And actually, one thing before I do that is I want to quickly touch on, tie up something that we didn't talk about in a previous video, which was how many, and it's pretty important, how many cubes can you actually have, assets can you have for a given company. So the way it works is, we've already talked about grow, but another type of action you can take is shift. A shift is when you take it from an existing place like this and you move it over to, like, say, clothing, like that. So here's a shift. Let's execute it. You notice that you can always shift to one adjacent location. That's a shift action. It's a pretty important action. And you can't shift if there's only one. So if I try to shift from here, you notice I can't do it. So there's always, if a company's put an asset in a sector, it's always going to have at least one. So you can only shift if there's 2 or more assets. And you can only shift into adjacent areas, just like you can only grow into adjacent areas as well. Anyway, sorry for that aside. I just wanted to tie that up. So coming back to the player powers, so we've talked about the banker's power, we've talked about the bureaucrat's power. The other 3 players, player 3, 4, and 5, their power happens after the action phase. So let's just skip ahead to the end of the action phase for this round 2, or turn 2. So now we're at the end, and we've entered into the management response phase. So all 3 of the other players, 3, 4, and 5, they have their special ability here. And the way it works is they basically can take an action. So in the first, player 3 is the entrepreneur. He can do an increased demand action. So let's say he wants to increase demand over here. He can say, hey, I want to increase demand for this red guy over here, and so he wants to bring it over from here. So he does that. And the only issue with this is he can't unilaterally do it. He needs to elicit the support of one other player. So he can go into the list here and he can select one other player. Let's say he thinks player 4 will approve it. So he clicks, or maybe he just wants to see what player 4 will do. I mean, maybe it's an information gathering exercise more than an actual trying to deploy the capital. So he then says, okay, I'm going to try to increase demand and I'm going to let player 4 approve it or deny it. So after he's already committed to the proposed action, the player that he's asking, in this case player 4, sees the proposed action and can either reject it or affirm it. So let's say he affirms it. In this case, what happens is that action happened, and you can see demand increased as per normal increased demand. So that's the entrepreneur. The other one is the executive. That's player 4. The executive is almost identical to the entrepreneur, except for instead of a demand growth, he does a grow or a shift company asset. So he can basically take an asset, let's say from red, and he can throw it on the board somewhere. Let's say he wants to throw a red one in travel. Again, he needs to elicit the support of one player. Let's say player 1 in this case says, no, I don't want that to happen. So you notice the action didn't happen, and that's it. That he doesn't get to propose like another location. He gets to propose one, and he has to commit to his proposal before the approving player approves or rejects it. So that's kind of how that works. And then finally there's the politician, and he's, again, he or she is very similar, but this time with rotations. So he or she can propose a rotation and say, hey, I want to rotate the Senate, and again looks for a player to support him. And then in this case, let's say the player supported it, and sure enough we saw a rotation. It's the end of the round, stock prices are going all over the place, and that's that. And then you just go back into operations phase, and the game just continues like that for 5 rounds. The important thing to note is in the 4th round, in the 5th round, there is no investing round. So the investing rounds are only in the second, third, and fourth round, turns. Sorry, I'm mixing terms and I shouldn't be doing that. So turn 1, you're automatically given a stock, a 1 long position randomly. Turns 2, 3, and 4 is when you do investing, where you're going long and going short. And then round 5, there's no shorting or longing. So it's just an action round. So that's that. That's the game. My name again is Justin Anderson. You can reach me at ruski.canuk@gmail.com. Please contact me if you have any questions, any issues, any comments, feedback, whatever. Just contact me. And yeah, so I just wanted to make these. You're probably seeing this because you're either on the physical or on the digital publishing side of this project, and I wanted to give you guys a way to really quickly learn this game without having to trudge through the rules, and sometimes it's a lot easier just to see it kind of in action. I'm sure this will lead to a lot of questions. For example, you can read what it says here for how these different profitabilities are calculated. There is a few issues things that we didn't really touch on. Like, for example, there's a competition factor. So if multiple companies are in the same area, then they'll sort of compete and the profitability will go down a bit. We also didn't get into the specifics of exactly how the calculations are made for profitability. And those are pretty important to the game, but I would say that they're in the rules, and it probably doesn't make too much sense to talk about it here. It's just the main idea is if you're in high demand areas, you'll be more profitable and your stock share will go up, and in low demand areas it'll go down. So it's pretty simple. Yeah, so and then at the end of the game, what you do is you just take all of your shares and you add up the value, and the value of each share is really what the price was when you bought it. Okay, and then if it's a long share, then however much you increased it from that price, or however much it went up or down from that price, affects your share or your net value. And same with the short, but just in reverse. In the short, you want them to go down instead of up. So that's important, because if a stock's doing really well, it might seem like it's in a great position, but it's already so high that it may not go that much higher. And there's also some effects in the price. If we pull up the price here, you don't see this, it's in the rules. But if a company's already very high, it also has this thing called expectations that get priced into the stock, meaning that it needs to continue to generate reasonable profit, especially the higher it goes, in order to maintain the share price. So basically, that combats this effect of kind of a runaway effect of one stock just becoming the best stock and other ones becoming the worst. They actually bounce. I've seen some games where you do have sort of a consistent strong performer and weak performers, and I've seen other games where it's completely random and all over the place, or others where it totally reverses. So it's a wide dispersion. That's part of playtesting, and I think we've gotten there. But yeah, so anyway, I'll leave it at that. I'll stop talking now and let you guys enjoy the game. And if you have any questions, reach out. Peace.